Resident Evil 6 released over 11 years ago and is arguably one of the most, if not the most, controversial release in the Resident Evil franchise and even in Capcom as a whole. It would end up being one of the key motivators for the soft reboot that is Resident Evil 7, which managed to fortunately resurrect the franchise after the burial that is Resident Evil 6. With the rampant remakes of the games prior to 7 in full force, it seems quite evident that Capcom is looking to remake all the mainline entries of Resident Evil from 1 to 6, with 5 and 6 being the final games on that list. And I guess you could include Resident Evil 1 in there too if you look at it by which games have been redone with over-the-shoulder gameplay, but of course whether or not Resident Evil 1 needs a treatment, or I should say the remake treatment with over-the-shoulder gameplay, I think that is a discussion for another video. But in this video today I will be getting the discussion rolling on how I think Resident Evil 6 could be improved with a remake, and of course feel free to continue this discussion down below, whether that's adding new points or expanding upon the points that I make in this video. But without wasting any more time, let's jump straight into it. Starting it off, we have the survival horror element. So of course Resident Evil, if there's one thing you associate it to, it would be survival horror. That's literally the roots of the franchise. That's where it started, and that's unfortunately where it started to divert from, but it has slowly started to creep back towards that direction, fortunately. Of course, as I said in the introduction, RE7 was that last straw which managed to absolutely unite the community and make Resident Evil survival horror and popular again, fortunately, and that was bringing in the old long-term fans as well as a lot of new fans as well. So Resident Evil 7 is a massive pivotal point in the Resident Evil lineup, which managed to resurrect the franchise, as I was saying, and a key component of that game was survival horror. So with Resident Evil 6, it's obviously clear action was quite a strong point in this game. It was something they tried to delve towards, as of course Resident Evil 5 and 4 did quite well and they started to bring action in. Of course 4 started it off with a good mix of action and survival horror, and then 5 started to amp up the action to the point where the second half of the game you were just in Call of Duty. Of course that wasn't the case, it was Call of Duty with BOWs, you could call it, and then 6 just went absolutely haywire and was all out shooting. Like with Chris's campaign, it was pretty much just a military simulator, and then with the other two campaigns it was a mix of both. I think with Leon's, they did try to capture the survival horror with the beginning segment of the game, but then that also started to derail across the course of the story. And then with Jake's campaign, I think that was similar to Chris's, where there was just a lot of shooting, not too much scare factor. Of course you did have that one segment where the Ustanak, I think that was its name, I think that's how you say it, where you're in that cave and if you get caught you get killed straight away, but I think that was a little too scripted. For my liking at least, it didn't really give me that survival horror feeling. It was more so you just hide, and if you don't hide to a specific standard you're just insta-killed. It wasn't like a stalker type role like we had with Nemesis and Mr. X. I think the key thing to improve here across the board with the entire story would be increasing the emphasis on the dark atmosphere, the dark spots in the game, and possibly having more extreme zombie behaviour, and the key emphasis on this is the word zombie. Of course Leon's campaign did start off with the dark residents, where zombies were they were a bit scarier in comparison to the rest of the game, and of course in Resident Evil as a whole they did a decent job with trying to capture that, okay, zombies are scary again, they could pop out of any corner, but I think it was still not as scary given it's the 6th installment. We're kind of used to shooting zombies in the head and just being able to dispatch them very quickly, and of course we're playing with characters that canonically should be able to dispatch these zombies really easily. I think if they went for more World War Z type zombie behaviour, it would have done a lot for the game, as of course this would elevate the zombie difficulty, which is expected given it's the 6th installment, but also help keep that zombie factor in the game. It is Resident Evil. It was a bit annoying that they started to delve towards BOWs and weird mutations. I think they just needed to take a step down, similar to how 7 did it. In 7's case, of course, it wasn't a zombie, but they did try to create a base form of an enemy and try keep that consistent throughout, which was a slow moving enemy, similar to how a zombie from the original games would act. One of the other things that took away from the survival horror element a lot was the explosions. I think explosions were riddled throughout this game. In every single campaign there was an explosion, I think in at least every chapter if I'm not mistaken, and I think it was a bit overboard. I understand it is supposed to be like a worldwide outbreak and everything is just going to shit, but I think the explosions kind of took away from you're in a tight, concise area where something can easily jump out at you. And with the game being co-op, which I will expand upon later in this video, I think that was even more so of a thing that they needed to emphasize the horror as much as they could, because co-op alone already takes a lot away. But of course, as I said, I will expand upon that later in the video. Another thing they could have improved upon is in the first half of the game, at the very least, having more close quarter encounters. I think Leon's campaign tried to do it at the beginning, and then it just derailed very quickly into just a shooter on the streets, like very arcadey, and the zombies lost a lot of their scare factor. Close quarter encounters is one of like the easiest ways for them to maintain that horror element, and of course they could do this in a multitude of ways, like even with Chris in the weird laboratory that he went to in the final act of his campaign. If they did just jump back to having just regular infected but very tight corridors in that lab, I think that could have easily just been a little solution to having a bit of scare elements in his campaign, which of course ended up just being a military shooter. And I think the final thing they could have added for the survival horror aspect would have been free roam, as of course this would introduce the potential for having stalker type enemies. It would have the potential for having enemies like Crimson Heads, where if you are having to backtrack through an area to collect something, you would of course have to make sure that you dispose of zombies properly so they're not coming back even stronger. Of course they don't have to use Crimson Heads, they could reintroduce, or I should say introduce, a different type of enemy which is a similar concept but still keep to that grounded zombie enemy type, which I will be expanding upon in the enemy design part of this video. But moving on to the next one, which kind of links into that free roam and toning down the action and just everything as a whole, would be a cohesive narrative. We do have 4 campaigns in the public release of Resident Evil 6 that all run simultaneously, which I think was quite a lot for a single game. Of course, a lot of locations were shared between the campaigns, and I think some segments in the game would use those said locations for a bit too long. And of course, if you played a different campaign and there was a character crossover, you would play that segment again and it was just as long. So it was a bit annoying to have those segments in the game. I think the campaign could have easily been shortened into either 1 or 2 campaigns instead of having 4 stories running at the same time. They could have had one campaign where it's all the main characters, Chris, Leon, and possibly Jake, which I will come on to on my next point. But the second campaign would of course be Ada Wong, who is quite a big component of the main story in Resident Evil 6. And she does go off on her own a lot, and she pops up here and there throughout the game. So it would be perfect to have separate ways to, if you would like to call it. Of course, it wouldn't be called separate ways. It could be, who knows, if they ever remade 6 and wanted to have a special name for Ada's campaign. I think they just called it Ada's campaign in the original. But getting back on track, I think the game easily could have been shortened into those 2 campaigns, as of course there was a lot of filler in each of these campaigns, which I think they could have just removed and took the best components, best parts and most important segments of each campaign, and the game would have still been long enough. I think the game was way too long if you combine all 4 campaigns. For me personally, I think I played through Leon's campaign, had an okay time, got through Chris's campaign, and then maybe 2/3 of the way in I was kind of just fatigued and I never got to Jake's campaign for a while. Ada's campaign, of course, it's always fun to play as Ada. She does have that, she's just in the background, has a grapple hook, it's kind of cool. It's a different take on what generally happens in the main storylines of these games. I think Separate Ways was a great example of how Ada works in the background, so it's always fun to have that perspective in a Resident Evil game. But definitely think if they did Remake 6, they should not have 4 campaigns running simultaneously. And as for Jake, whether or not they should remove him, I think that's quite a good discussion. Personally, I think if they removed him, I would be absolutely satisfied with that. He was an okay character, but he seemed to have just been added in to 6 and then dropped off quickly. So if they did just take away his narrative, they could have Chris fight the Ustanak instead of whatever that weird fish creature was in the lab. I don't think it was a fish, it was more so of an octopus. But either way, I think they could have easily removed a lot of story elements from Jake's side and then just had the main campaign having Chris and Leon, and then you just switch between them throughout the game. And I think that alone would have still maintained a very cohesive narrative and still been engaging to the player without having 25 odd hours of having the same story retold 3 times or 4 times, with Ada's campaign of course, in the same locations and the same events taking place, but you're just changing perspective. Definitely drop a comment down below as to whether or not you think Jake should remain in Resident Evil 6's story, or as a character in Resident Evil as a whole, if they were to remake Resident Evil 6. It would be interesting to see how the community differs on that, and of course do give your reason why, and I look forward to reading how that discussion goes. And then of course finally, the last point I would like to discuss for the cohesive narrative would of course be the final boss, which I think just deserves and only makes sense for it to be Simmons. Of course he is the one who initiated the outbreak, so it would make sense for him to be the one to be taken down at the very end. I think they could still include the Ustanak and the Ada clone, and of course this could go 2 ways depending on how they were to make the game. If they were to include Jake, I think they could have it how it was in the original, of course this time in one singular story though. So Jake would fight the Ustanak, Chris would go on to fight the Ada clone instead of the octopus, and then Leon would fight Simmons, so the only change there would just be Chris's final encounter. And then if they were to remove Jake, I think they could just have the Ada clone as Ada's final boss in her campaign, and then Chris would fight the Ustanak and Leon fighting Simmons as the final boss. And they possibly could even have Chris and Leon unite for that final boss encounter. But of course, as I've said throughout this video, feel free to continue the discussion down below, whether that's expanding on my points or adding your own points. I would be interested to see how you guys think the final boss encounter should go down if, once again, if they were to remake Resident Evil 6. Moving on to the next point, we have refining the gameplay. So in this section, of course, the gameplay of Resident Evil 6, there was a lot of people that did enjoy it. It was very versatile, there was a lot you could do, and it did add a lot to the Mercenaries mode. But I think with refining the gameplay, I think they could have made it so that each of the main characters had a specific moveset and playstyle, as I think that would have really diversified their stories, and just gameplay overall would have been more engaging for each campaign instead of just having the exact same mechanics. I think Jake had a slightly different skill set when it comes to combat, but as for Chris and Leon, they were virtually the same. I think for Leon, they could have kept the diving mechanic in the game and removed it for the other 2 characters so they can't dive around, and Leon would be very proficient with the pistol. Maybe they could have it so he has less bloom with the pistol, slightly increased damage, and then with Chris he would have increased melee damage, so he would be able to perform finishes on a single tier above zombies, whereas Leon would only be able to finish zombies. I think that would make a bit more sense and add a bit more diversity. And Chris could even potentially have more proficiency in assault rifles, for example, so he would have less bloom and slightly increased damage. And then as for Jake, they could keep the original combat mechanics in the game where you're able to just punch and kick as you please, whereas Chris and Leon can't, and I think that would just help diversify each of the stories and help keep the characters more diverse in how they actually are. Of course, canonically, in the animations, for example, with the animated movies, all the characters are there dodging, diving, sprinting and doing all sorts, but from a gameplay mechanics standpoint, I think it would be good just to diversify each of the characters and give them their strengths and weaknesses, opposed to just having the same characters with just not much difference. Other than Jake, of course, he has the increased combat capability in the original, as you see when you fight the Ustanak at the end, but other than that, they were practically the same. And then I think they could also introduce a dodge mechanic similar to how they have in RE3, so this would just help with if they were to increase the close quarter encounters, you do have the capability to dodge out of the way if you learn how to time it correctly. And yeah, as for refining gameplay, as I said, it is quite a strong component of the original, and it did make the Mercenaries mode one of the best in the franchise, I dare say. It was very enjoyable with the amount of moves you can pull off with each of the characters. Of course, as I said, a lot of the moves were very similar, so it didn't make too much difference which character you were playing as. But once again, feel free to expand upon this point in the comment section down below, and that brings us on to our next point, which is enemy design. I think they did get a bit over the top in this game, especially with Jake's campaign and Chris's campaign. I think if they were to remove the more overly exaggerated mutations, it would do a lot for the game and make zombies more prominent. And as I said, they can make the zombies more extreme in terms of the behavior, just to make sure that difficulty is increasing as the game's mainline number is increasing, as it is the 6th entry. So having just a basic slow walking zombie would probably be just a bit boring at this point. They could always have the zombies walk slow at the beginning and then mutate over time, and then they turn into those running World War Z type zombies where they're just smashing their heads on windows trying to get in. And I think this would also help create more of an emphasis on the zombie threat, opposed to having an arcade shooter type scenario, as of course I think this was a prominent thing throughout the game, where even though zombies would be introduced, like for example in China when Leon is in the city and the gas goes off, the bomb goes off that releases the gas that infects everyone in the city. I think even then it was still not that scary to have zombies everywhere, as you could just blast your way through everything very easily. So I think if they were to increase that zombie threat by having a more stronger zombie, more extreme in behaviour, fast running, very versatile and agile, it would increase the difficulty, of course, from a gameplay standpoint, but also explain why it's harder for the character, that being Leon or even Chris, who are both very experienced in this field. It would better explain as to why they're having difficulty fighting through this new version of the zombie horde. And once again, as I said throughout this video, just bringing back zombies in general, it would be a big thing for the franchise. And as for the higher tier zombies, or I should say BOWs, I think it would be really cool if they were to remove the weird mutations that we saw throughout the original and just add some classic tyrants back in, as I think with, for example, Resident Evil Damnation, the animation movie, we did have I think 3 tyrants in there, 2 to 3, possibly even 5. I'm losing count of how many appeared, and of course all of them died, so I'm losing count if they died or mutated further and came back, but it was 3 to 5 tyrants in that movie, and I think they could have easily scattered a few tyrants throughout the game in Resident Evil 6, which would have made for a fun higher tier zombie, or higher tier BOW I should say, and still maintain that Resident Evil aesthetic, as tyrants are a massive part of the Resident Evil franchise, so it would have been really cool to see them brought back for that 6th mainline game. But moving on to the final section of this video, we have the co-op. So this is a bit of a shorter section. Of course, there are 2 ways to approach this. I can't really think of a third way. It would be either to refine the co-op or remove it. Of course, if they were to bring the co-op back again, I can't see them just leaving it the same. And of course, if they were to refine it, that would include better AI, and it was already good, to be fair. At least in comparison to Resident Evil 5, it was a step up, but of course they can just make it a bit more up to date and smarter, just so if you don't have someone to play with, it would still be a smart character and someone that you can rely on and get the job done regardless of what difficulty it's on. And then if they were to remove the co-op, that would of course have the benefits of being a scarier experience, as of course if you're solo, you're not having anyone else to rely on, and it would just help more easily build up those scares in those close quarter encounters, as you once again you have no one else there with you. Of course, the odd team up here and there can still take place throughout the story. It would still fit the game quite well. It is a general trope in the Resident Evil franchise to have those segments where you team up with an AI controlled character, and I think this would be a great way to still include those characters from the original RE6. So that would be Sherry, Helena and Piers. In Chris's case, I think this would be more prominent, where he would have more so of those areas where he's with another character. In of course, in his story's context, that would be his team, and then when they get killed off, it would return to that solo experience for the rest of the game, and still get that character development of how from the original games would act. One of the other things that took away from the survival horror elements, it could easily be Leon, was the explosions. I think explosions were riddled throughout this game. Still in every single campaign, there was an explosion. I think in at least not done much with every chapter, if I'm not mistaken. He could, of course, I think it was a bit overboard. I understand it is supposed to be like a co-op was definitely one of those aspects that everything was just going to shit in the original RE6 and was generally considered explosions kind of took away from you're in a tight, concise area. So I would be interested to jump out at you. And with the game being co-op, which I will expand upon later, and its drawbacks if they do bring it back. I can see them bringing it back. I think with RE5 and 6, they do want to, if they were to remake it, based on how they've remade the previous games, I think they would maintain the core elements of each of those titles, and I think co-op and that AI controlled character companion is quite a big aspect of both of those games, so I can definitely see that mechanic making a return. But of course, as I've said multiple times throughout this video, feel free to drop your opinion down below as to whether or not this aspect should return. But with that said, guys, that does bring us to the conclusion of this video. I think RE6 in general does have quite a solid foundation, but it was just very poorly executed. Like, what they were going for was quite ambitious, and I can see why they thought it was a good idea, but clearly when they executed it, it was terribly executed. And I think a lot of that comes from what we've discussed in this video. That would be the survival horror element, which I think clearly was just dropped to the side. And I think they kind of had it at the beginning of Leon's story, and then they just threw it to the side and threw explosions and guns straight in your face, and then it just derailed from there. And of course it got to such a bad point that RE7 had to just go all the way back to basics, to being set in a house with just very close quarter scares, which definitely says a lot. And then cohesive narrative was another thing. I think this dropped the engagement like mad, as of course, as I said, the locations were repeated, and in general there were just segments in the game that easily could have been cut, as they did overlap with other characters, and then it just kind of got boring towards like the second and third campaigns, where you're just revisiting the same location for pretty much the same task except a different perspective. And then refining the gameplay, of course, I think this was a bit more of a minor one, but I still think it would just have added a bit more diversity to each of the characters, just so it just helped engage the player a bit more from a different standpoint. And then enemy design, I think this was a big one. Visuals are massive to whether or not a game is successful or not, and I think aesthetically it was kind of going a bit too far away from Resident Evil opposed to what we used to, and I think it wasn't in a good way. Of course, sometimes going away from what we used to is a good thing, it's nice to experiment, but in this case I think they just went too far away from having the nice basic zombie and elevating that same base zombie. And then same with the higher tier enemies, I think Tyrants not being in the game was a big missed opportunity. As for me personally, and many may agree, many might disagree, I think Tyrants in a city is just a perfect combination, and it was a massive missed opportunity in the original RE6. And of course, just refining the co-op or possibly removing it would also be one of the things I think they definitely need to consider for when they remake the game. From how I see it, I think the likelihood of this game being remade is extremely high, and I think the same goes for Resident Evil 5. I can't see them remaking 1 to 5 and not doing 6, or doing 1 to 6 and not doing 5. It just doesn't make sense. With Code Veronica, for example, of course, that's not a mainline numbered entry, so I can kind of see them giving it a miss, but I don't think that would be the case either, as of course if you did see my previous video, they did do the Capcom survey, and it was one of the highest ranked games that's been requested for a remake. And if you know Capcom, as of recently, they do try to tend to what the fans are requesting, and of course that's where the money's going to be made. I think if they did do Code Veronica as a remake, it would be massively successful. But just getting back on track with RE6, it was that one game in the franchise that was received so poorly they had to go back to basics with 7, and luckily 7 managed to pull it off, and they were able to resurrect the franchise and dig itself out of the hole that this game made for the Resident Evil franchise. But with that said, guys, that does bring us to the end of this video. As I said throughout, be sure to drop your thoughts down below as to what you would like to see in a Resident Evil 6 remake and how you would like to change the game in comparison to the original. As always, a like would be extremely appreciated. If you did enjoy, it is extremely appreciated and it helps out the channel a ton. And subscribe for a lot more Resident Evil content. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye.